The Native Americans made up a large population around the United States and right here in central Louisiana. In honor of Native American Month in November, Johnny Atkinson studied the history of local tribes and what they went through in this week's Back Home in Louisiana.
Way back in the 1700s, European settlers tried to work with the Native Americans and conducted trading with the local Indian tribes. Settlers in Louisiana brought metal tools, knives, and clothing, and trade with the Louisiana Indian tribes became common.
In the 1730s, we had a relationship with the French, and so a lot of the things that were given to us as gifts, as tributes from their leadership in New Orleans and our people here.
But the growing number of European settlers carried germs and disease which thrived in the fast-growing populations around Louisiana, and the Native American population was devastated by settlers, as they had never experienced smallpox, measles, or even the flu. These new viruses tore through the continent, killing an estimated 90% of the Native Americans.
And we were a small tribe. You know, we had been decimated by the disease that the Europeans brought over, the Spanish. So we were small. We were looking for protection. We were looking for alliances.
Historian Paul Price has studied the origins of central Louisiana and has documented much of Louisiana's unknown history and much of the association with the Native Americans.
When the settlers came, it was a completely new way of life. It was a completely different culture. So instead of hunting deer and small game and gathering nuts and berries, they learned that you could get a job and you could be paid wages and you could buy things like cloth or iron tools. Those were things that they didn't have.
Today, much of the Native American heritage is being restored and honored around Cenla as Native American tribes began opening casinos in the 1990s.
But it was about putting land into trust, you know, where it would be part of our reservation, designated for gaming, and was just an economic boom for the local communities.
The casinos bring in lots of jobs and tax revenue, which continues to greatly preserve the legacy of the American Indian in central Louisiana. I'm Johnny Atkinson, back home in Louisiana.
If you have an idea for a story about a special person or place in Louisiana, you can send Johnny a description in an email at backhomeinlouisiana@klb.com.